are not attached to them. But the body of holy individuals is impure. Since impure dharmas are painful, what is the mistake in asserting that the saints feel bodily suffering? But in fact, these sufferings felt by their bodies are faint and rare. Question. If all that is impermanent is suffering, the path too is suffering. How can you drive suffering away with suffering? Answer. The aphorism all that is impermanent is suffering applies to the 5 aggregates of attachment, but the path, although impermanent insofar as it is formation, is not called suffering. Why? Because it destroys suffering and does not create attachment. United with the wisdoms of emptiness and non-self, it is impermanent but it is not suffering. This is why the Arhats, at the moment they obtain the path, say the following stanza. We do not rejoice in being reborn. Neither do we rejoice in dying. With mindfulness and awareness, we are waiting to leave when the time comes. When the Buddha entered nirvana, Ananda, and the disciples not yet detached from passion, who had not yet cultivated the eightfold noble path, wept and lamented. The Anagamins, detached from desire, were all frightened. The Arhats whose impurities were destroyed remained impassive and only said, "The eye of the world has disappeared too soon." It is because they possessed the power of the path that these Arhats who had received great favors from the Buddha and appreciated his immense qualities did not experience any suffering. This is why we know that the path, although impermanent, is not a cause of suffering and therefore it is not called suffering. Only the 5 aggregates of attachment are suffering. Why? Because one clings to them, because they are impermanent and insecure. Here in regard to the meaning of suffering, what has been said above concerning Vedanasmritayupasthana should be fully repeated. Furthermore, those who possess a body are always suffering, but out of stupidity, they do not take it into account. Thus it is said, since it is very tiring to ride a horse, one looks for a place to stand up. Since standing up is very tiring, one seeks a place to sit down. Since sitting down too long is very tiring, one looks for a place to lie down in peace. Much fatigue results from these activities. What at first was pleasant then becomes painful. To look straight ahead or to the side, to breathe in and out, to bend down, to stretch out, to sit down, to get up, to walk or to stand still, to go or to come. Nothing can be done without suffering. Question. The 5 aggregates of attachment are suffering, but it is as a result of a subjective notion of suffering that they are suffering. Actually, if everything is suffering, why did the Buddha say? There are 3 kinds of feeling. Pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and feeling that is neither unpleasant nor pleasant. And if suffering comes from a subjective notion of suffering, how can you say that the holy truth of suffering concerns a real suffering? Answer. Yes, the 5 aggregates of attachment are suffering, but ordinary people, under the influence of the fourfold error and urged on by desire, consider the 5 objects of enjoyment as happiness. It is as though someone smeared ointment onto a man's ulcer, and when his suffering has stopped, he thinks this ulcer, which itself is not happiness, is happiness. The Buddha spoke of 3 kinds of feelings in accordance with the views of the world, but in reality there is no happiness there. If there were truly happiness in the 5 aggregates of attachment, why did the Buddha say, the destruction of the 5 aggregates of attachment is happiness? Furthermore, since the mind of happiness arises in relation to the loved object, happiness is not assured definitively. If happiness were assured, it would not depend on attachment of the mind in the same way that if fire were really hot, it would not depend on kindling to heat up. But as happiness is not assured, here it is called suffering. Furthermore, what the world wrongly considers to be happiness can create innumerable fruits of suffering in the present lifetime and in the future lifetime. This is why it is called suffering. Just as a little bit of poison poured into the water of a big river cannot change the water, so the poisonous plant that the world wrongly thinks is happiness is no longer visible in the great waters of suffering. Thus it is said, when a being falls from the paradises and is reborn in hell, he remembers the former bliss of paradise. The palace courtesans showed themselves to him in a crowd, the parks and pools rejoiced his heart. Now he sees the fires of hell coming to burn him like a great fire consuming a bamboo forest. Then, while still seeing the pleasures of paradise, he is alarmed in vain. That is useless. The concept of suffering concerns the same objects as the concept of impermanence. Analysis of suffering in these many different ways is called the concept of suffering. 3. The concept of non-self. Concept of non-self. That which is suffering is non-self. Why? The 5 aggregates of attachment are all suffering and have no independence. If they have no independence, they are non-self. If they had an independent self, it would be impossible for the body to feel suffering. Thus it is said, there are fools who consider their body or their mind as their self. Gradually they become strongly attached to them. They do not understand the law of impermanence. There is no agent in this body, neither is there any perceiver. This body is without a master. And, nevertheless, it does all kinds of things. From the 6 organs and the 6 objects arise the 6 kinds of consciousnesses. From the coming together of the 3 contact arises. From contact as condition, there arise feeling, memory, and action, in the same way as fire arises. When the lens, kindling, and the sun come together, organs, objects, and consciousnesses having come together, the action to be accomplished is realized. There is continuity, as in the seed, the sprout, and the stem. Furthermore, there is no Atman because the characteristics of the Atman do not exist. Dharmas must have a characteristic so that we may know that they exist. Thus, if we see smoke and we feel heat, we know there is a fire. Because there are differences in characteristics between the 5 sense objects, we know they exist. Because beings of various sorts conceive and compute things in different ways, we know that there are minds and mental events. But since the Atman has no characteristic, we know it does not exist. Question. However, there is breathing, which is a characteristic of the Atman, and also the looking straight ahead and sideways, life, mind, suffering or happiness, affection or aversion, the will, etc., which are characteristics of the Atman. If there were no Atman, then who would have this breathing, this looking straight ahead or sideways, this life, this